have all heard of marriage, right? Marriage possibly as a lifelong commitment, a serious commitment. But there's another kind of marriage that often flies under the radar, and that is the commitment you make with a possible business partner. So, of course, while many people understand the importance of a marriage contract, a shareholder agreement is just as crucial in a business setting, and you must carefully consider it to set you up for future success. Imagine if 5 years down the line, a partner wants to leave, you want to bring in new talent, or the person you're working with becomes an absolute nightmare to be around. What do you do in these situations? Well, a shareholder agreement may be one of those things to protect you, everyone else involved, and hopefully prevent some messy conflicts. Now, I'm going to be welcoming a panel to the stage, a panel of experts who are going to share with you how to negotiate good terms for a shareholder agreement. Let's give a round of applause for Daniel, Thomas, Gian, Ildiko, and our moderator, Peter.
Thank you very much for this introduction. Good evening, everyone. Now it works. Thanks. Before jumping right to in our discussion, I would like to very briefly just introduce our panelists, as I think most of you will already know them. So just next to me, we have Gian Reto Porta. He's the founder of Conta Vista, where they sold the company 7 years ago quite successfully. Currently is the founder and the CEO of Norm, his new startup. But he is also a very active investor since his exit. And so he became the Business Angel of the Year 22. That's Gian. Then we have Ildiko. She was one of the first employees and the CEO of a Swiss fintech unicorn. She now is a partner at Maximon. Maximon invests in the field of longevity in startups. Then we have Daniel Andres. Daniel is the founder of Spicehaus. Spicehaus is a Swiss venture fund. They exclusively invest in Swiss startups. They have more than 20 companies in their portfolio, and these guys keep investing. Then we have Thomas Dübendorfer. He is the president of SICTIC. He is an angel investor since 2010. He is the Business Angel of the Year from SECA of 24, so 22, 24, we have both here. And I think he co-founded 9 startups, but might be 10 because every time I see him, it's one startup more. So how many is it now?
10 planned for end of the year. It's 10 planned this year.
Between 9 and 10?
Yeah.
Okay. My name is Peter Kuhn. I'm a partner at the MME Startup Desk. Yes. Let's start with our discussion. So we talk about how to negotiate good terms for a shareholder agreement. But first of all, how we're going to start that process. So we're founders. We want to end up with the shareholders agreement. But what we're going to do first, are we drafting a shareholders agreement and bring that to the table? And are we bringing together with us 2 lawyers and 2 financial advisors? What's the start? What would you appreciate let's say, from an investor perspective? How should founders initiate that process? What's the first step? Daniel, you want to?
Sure.
Start here.
Thank you. I think, usually we come a bit later than the typical business angel. So I very much appreciate if the founders are actually prepared. So if they know what the terms are, what is typically discussed, what are the standards in Switzerland. And if you're addressing or if you're reaching out to a venture capital investor, they typically have already a portfolio. So why don't you speak with other founders that have already received money from Spicehaus or another venture capital investors, and then you can actually get some first feedback, what was important in the negotiations for that particular investor. So you yourself look very competent when you come to the table and speak with us.
John, what would you say? So what should a founder, well, you are a founder, how did you approach that? I mean, what was your first step? So did you get familiar with the terms? How did you do that? How did you approach that?
Yeah, I think like from a founder's perspective, it's really important. Of course, you should know what you want regarding terms and so on. But then I think it's important to, when you start the discussion, so it means you have an investor who is interested, that wants to discuss terms, that you have the founder and the person who invests. So a business angel, there it's easy, but with VCs, that it's really the relevant partner that's also decides, and then to really talk about the terms on a high level and like get to terms or see, do we find common ground regarding the terms, and then create a term sheet. Because I think with that you can save a lot of time, because if you go straight to the shareholder agreement, you are discussing about details and up and down, and you lose so much time, and lawyers are involved, and it gets complicated. So that's why I would really start with with a simple term sheet, agree on, like, let's say, the business terms, and then as a second step, then go into the details and into a more detailed shareholder agreement.
Ildiko, would you confirm that, or do you prefer to see a fully fledged shareholders agreement at the first meeting?
I think it's always a bit depend. I mean, in a shareholder agreement, one hand, you have also the terms, how you operate with an investor, but you also have usually how you operate together with your co-founder. And I think in that case, it's also important that you build up first this relationship with your co-founder. You discuss what are your values, what do you want to achieve with the company, what is your goal. If one of them want to sell very fast within 3-4 years, the other one is more like looking very long term. I think those are all points which you can align even before you even start a discussion about the legal stuff. And I think if you have a good alignment, then it's much easier also to figure out these details as well. So I would suggest first get to know each other, understand if there is a basis, so to say, to work together, if there is a common vision. And if you feel comfortable, then obviously I would also suggest that you start to negotiate these terms, but I would definitely not start with it.
Thomas, do you have anything to add here, or do you agree with what the others?
I think that don't discuss about details, discuss about the big picture, and there's no legal requirement to have a shareholders agreement. You can have a company without the shareholders agreement. It depends also on the investment instrument. If you have a convertible note which later converts into equity, maybe you do the shareholder agreement when the bigger round happens, when maybe a VC comes in. But if you give out equity, of course, it's good to know what is relevant for you. And that depends a lot on the dynamics around negotiating with investors. If you basically don't have a choice, you need to take in any investor because you don't get enough funding, it's a different discussion. And if you have 10 times more people than you need for funding, because is it a seller or buyer market kind of, right? And if too many people want to get in, you can make easier terms. And if you really need everybody, then they can renegotiate a lot, because the negotiation power is with those which, yeah, really you need them, and then they know you need them, and then you can't really negotiate very well, right? The best thing is you have too many, and then the founder can decide what's important. If you don't have enough, then it's the investors. So I think that's important to know. It's a process, it's not static, there's not the best term sheet. There's lots of things which you align on, and once you've aligned, then you can go into the terms and the shareholder agreement.
And maybe how detailed do you think the term sheet discussions should be? I mean, is it about, well, of course, we heard that it's figuring out whether we have any showstoppers in an early stage, but what's, do you already bring the lawyers at the table, or other advisors, or how far are you going when you discuss the term sheet? So on which level do we fly over the term sheet? What is your experience, John? Does it make sense to go in very much detail so that the shareholders agreement will most likely not lead to any complications? Or do you say, okay, now let's agree on the valuation and saying we will include standard terms in the shareholders agreement, and then we will see what standard terms are and whether we're going to all have the same understanding? So what's your view on that?
like from a founder's perspective, I would rather do it a bit more detailed, because what you have to keep in mind is that during this term sheet phase, you can talk to different investors, right? So you can also a bit like say, okay, if you don't like these terms, then I might do it with someone else. But as soon as you are in the drafting out the shareholder agreement, it gets harder. And some term sheets even have a clause in there where you cannot do that until you've either done the shareholder agreement or not. So that's why, like, I think a lot of founders see this term sheet as something that takes time and is unnecessary. But I think from a founder's perspective, that's the time where you can really negotiate. So I would rather invest a bit more time in a good term sheet, and then, because if you agreed on it on a term sheet, then afterwards on the shareholder agreement, you can just say, look, we agreed on that. That's what we do. But if you don't have it in there, and then the investor comes with like the proposals, what they would like to have in the shareholder agreement, then it's a bit harder to argue.
What's the investor perspective on that? You like clauses where you say, well, it's going to be market standard, I don't know, whatever clause it should be, tag, drag, or do you also like to spell that out already in the term sheet? So what's the investor's perspective on that?
If I may, I think you asked at the beginning, do you want to have a lawyer already looking at the term sheet? I mean, I think from your perspective, you wouldn't say no to that. But don't forget, on the term sheet, there is usually something written that is called legally non-binding. So the term sheet is something that you receive when the due diligence is, in most cases, not fully finished. So things might change on your side, on the investor's side. And I think it's very important that you agree in the big picture on the terms. So yes, the terms should be listed there. At Spicehaus, we have a one-pager because we try to be very simple. We use the standard document in Switzerland and we highlight what is particularly important to us, but then you know whether those terms are agreeable to you or not. But going with that term sheet to a lawyer, and lawyers have that particular character of correcting every comma, and then we get a feedback with a lot of corrections that are actually completely meaningless to the big picture. So I think it's what John said originally, even when a VC comes, or we don't like to have discussions with lawyers at the term sheet negotiation level. We want to understand whether we can agree on the terms, or if there are special terms or specific terms that need more discussion. And don't forget, there might be terms that can be aggressive from your perspective. And I'm talking about, for example, the founder vesting. So if you have to give shares back in case you leave the company, but it does not only protect, or it's not only good for investors, it might actually be good for the co-founder that stays in the company. And the marriage, as we heard, is being left on the side, and you part from each other. Then you as a remaining co-founder might actually also benefit from that. So there are usually two ways on how to look at certain terms, and not only the venture term, or not only the investor who benefits from that.
Any other views on that? Or maybe we can also talk about, you said the term sheet is non-binding. That's of course correct, but in practice, Thomas or Ildiko, how often do you see that you deviate from a term sheet when it comes to the negotiations of the actual agreement? So what's the effect of a term sheet in your view? Is it, does the non-binding really have an impact in practice, or how do you see that? How would you describe that?
I mean, there's the legal side of things and there's the culture side of things. Typically in Switzerland, you don't even need to sign, you just need to say it, and then you basically commit to it, right? So in Switzerland, it's extremely rare if somebody basically agrees on terms that they would later come and do the opposite. If they sign a term sheet, even though it's non-binding, I've never seen that they would then go back and renegotiate afterwards. With US VCs, I've seen they sign a term sheet and then they didn't fulfill it. They just stopped and said, oh, now we have invested somewhere else, we don't do it. Like out of the blue. Even though they said in the phone calls they're going to do it, they signed the term sheet, they said now we're going to go into exclusivity and due diligence, but then that due diligence never started because they found apparently a better deal. And they can only invest so much because they have limited resources, and then they had everybody on the other deal. So that I've seen, mostly with some US VCs. And for them, it's not binding. It says here it's not binding. Not my problem. But in Switzerland, I haven't seen that. When people sign, they typically execute, and then it's also not a lot of discussion to change stuff. Unless there was a misunderstanding in one case where the founder misunderstood a term. He thought it's this, but it was the other kind of right. And then afterwards, he found out that he meant something else than what he negotiated. And then, of course, we went back and clarified. Because this is all new terms, tag-along, drag-along, vesting. It's super complicated language. And you need to really understand what it means. It's not just fluffy terms. It's very precise terms.
And maybe also like from a founder's perspective, that's really a red flag if you agree on something and then the investors want to renegotiate something that you agreed on. I think, because as we heard in the intro, it's quite a long-term relationship that you go in with your investor. So I think if it starts like that, you should really think if that's the right partner for you. And I also think Switzerland is such a small community. Also, as an investor, you couldn't do that too many times.
I would also say that I think what is important to understand the difference also between term sheet and the shareholder agreement. Of course, the term sheet contains all the most important information about the deal. And it's important, I agree with everyone, that once you agreed on those terms, that you should not really change them anytime. But if we are talking, for example, about the shareholder agreement, those are very often very large documents of 30, 40, or even longer pages. And there you have also, of course, the chance to really describe certain things so that there is not a misunderstanding. And I think especially for founders who do this maybe first time, it's really important that you take enough time before to understand also all of these terms and what the implication can be. And then I think a good lawyer can really help you. And why I'm saying good lawyer, because I think it's really important that this person knows the startup scene, knows the country, and can really advise you, because then this lawyer can really help you even to find like common agreements between you and your shareholders, or pointing out things you were not even thinking about that it has an impact. But on the other hand, if you bring very early on someone, a lawyer who is maybe not that specialized in this scene, then you may receive a document with a lot of red marks, and then it could be even a deal breaker. So you need to be very much aware of this.
Yeah, and if you don't have a good lawyer yet, the best way as a founder to find one is to talk to other founders. So ask other founders, like who did you work with, who was good, who was pragmatic, and try to find your lawyer that way.
Yeah, so I think one of the key takeaways is that the term sheet, although it is binding, I think it is important for a founder to get well prepared in the negotiations of a term sheet. Particularly, as John said, that it also makes time to spend a bit more time there, because in order for the term sheet to serve its purpose, to facilitate the subsequent negotiations, it is important that the founders understand what they agreed to in the term sheet. Otherwise, there are going to be discussions and conflicts in the future. So it's also very much, I think, in the interest of the investors that the founders really fully understand what they're signing. So now we talked a lot about the process, how the term sheet will be established and negotiated. But let's have a bit a closer look at the clauses of a term sheet. So which clauses? Let's again start with the founder's perspective. What will you say that a founder should be very much aware of, not to do this mistake, because otherwise it can prevent him or makes it very difficult to attract founders or investors in the future. So is there anything that you would say, be aware of that, because otherwise you're going to have problems. You will have a financing now, but might not so easy to attract more funds in the future.
Yeah, or other troubles. I think the main one from a founder's perspective is like some kind of veto rights that are connected just to one party. Those are really bad, especially if that one party is some kind of a institutional investor where like the leadership can change every day. You're more or less like exposed then to what happens there. So I think if there are vetoes or stuff like that, it should always be structured in a way where different investors have to say no so that it's really a veto and not just like one party. I think that's, like from a founder perspective, that's really bad.
If we look at from the other perspective, or there might be any clauses from investor which are not, I also look on the time, so maybe one clause from an investor perspective, and then we can also open up to questions from the audience. So, but is there, what would be the view from an investor on the most critical clause which cannot or must be in a term sheet or in the shareholders agreement?
Yeah, from my side, I really want to see vesting of all the founders. Because if somebody owns a big chunk of the company and then just walks away with 20% shares, it's very difficult to repair that. And it's a protection between the founders, it's also protection for the investor, because if somebody has too much shares but is not engaged and gets much more than anybody else they're going to hire later, it's very hard to motivate key hires. It's very hard to convince VCs that you have a good setup, right? Because why would get somebody 20% of the proceeds if he has only worked 1 month at the company? And so vesting for me among the founders is super important. It also aligns a little bit the long-term view that we engage here. It's not you are a co-founder and then you get a lot of shares and then you get a lot of proceeds. It's like, no, it's the beginning of a marathon. And if you're not in for the next up to 10 years, maybe you're not the right person, right? If people are against vesting, I often feel they have this thing, for them it's like an employment, it's not entrepreneurship.
I think also, like in all cases, you need to be just like also very flexible. Like, of course, you can say no, that every investor wants to have like liquidation preferences or anti-dilution clauses, but I think you always need to kind of think with both sides. Like, maybe something what for you now as a founder or investor is beneficial right now, but later this could even lead to a problem because no one wants to maybe invest into your company. So I think you always need to really find this balance of protection, but also to keep yourself also flexibility enough so that later stage also, later investor can also come to it. So I think that's also sometimes what a lot of founders maybe forget in the beginning and not thinking about this part.
I second everything that has been said so far. I think from a VC perspective, or generally if you get external money, you need to understand that this money is invested in you not for philanthropic reasons, or in most of the cases, those investors, they want to have a return. So your shareholders agreement should actually be something that remains in your drawer, and only if things go south, it's being picked up, right? Or taken out. And at the stages when we invest, typically the founder team has still the majority. So you can have the greatest shareholder agreement, but the founders can still do anything they want. And at Spicehaus Partners, we're advising our own funds, which basically means they're regulated, and we need to make sure that nothing bad can happen. So we need to have certain minority protection clauses that go sometimes a bit beyond a typical shareholder agreement, but it's not necessarily just to say no to growth or to veto everything. It's really more that founders in an adverse case cannot do something that was actually not discussed originally how the business should be structured and run.
I think we had a question, but we lost it now again. Might someone else answered it already? No, here. So what was your best and worst experience when you negotiated the term sheet? Anyone who wants to say so, has particular experience that he or she wants to share here?
I have one where Thomas was also involved. It was one of the worst. Like we had the term sheet negotiated, and then we were closing the round, and then a new competitor popped up, and one of the investors that signed the term sheet just went away because he was afraid of the new competitor. So that was quite an interesting behavior. And but I think we never saw that investor again, right, Thomas?
No, he didn't come back. No. I also had quite a bad experience with the Berlin-based early-stage investor. He made a term sheet, very nice terms, and he said, you know, when we work out the share agreements, standard terms apply. And then when the full thing came, it was like totally horrible, like full control over everything, like every single thing he could veto. He could have the majority in the board. He could even basically decide the direction of the company, even do a pivot if necessary. It's like, that's a joke. He writes standard terms and gives the nice thing, so you sign, and then you get something super horrible afterwards.
We talked about now some bad experience, but I think what I appreciate a lot is if a founder team focus on what the money is actually for. You want to have money, you want to have new investors because you want to fuel your growth. So if you know your terms, if you are prepared, if you get a term sheet, if you get a shareholder agreement that follows very much the standards that are used in the specific country here in Switzerland, and you actually ask around who has invested or who has received money from that specific investor, and you actually focus on growth and then speed. And that is the best experience when we have a founder that actually says, like, look, I talked already with a few guys in your portfolio. I know this is important to you. Those are the two things I want to renegotiate with you. And then actually a term sheet is done very quickly, and you feel this kind of bonding. And then whether it's a marriage or a marathon, but in any case, it's not a sprint. So if you don't waste too much time, I'm not saying not being diligent, but actually focusing on speed, getting the money, and then focusing really on your business. That's when I get the best feeling from the founders team. And at the end, it is the team you're investing in at early stages. So I think that is what I like most, and those were the best experiences I made. There was a question on the duration of a term sheet. I can only talk from our perspective. We usually provide a term sheet because we're the lead investor. So that can happen rather quick. So typically after 2-3 meetings, there is at least one meeting that is physical. So depending on our agendas, that's within 2-3 months. Sometimes we know the founders a bit longer. And then the due diligence starts. And what usually takes then a bit longer is drafting a 30 pages shareholder agreement. And all the investors that are participating need to give their own feedback. But I think something between 3 to 6 months from beginning to end is what you have to expect.
Thank you very much. So we're ending with a good experience from you and a ideal scenario of how to get from a term sheet to a financing round. So thank you very much for this discussion, and I hope you guys will all be around for the next 1 or 2 hours. So if you have any questions, talk to them. So they're here. They will happy to talk to you about how to get to your shareholders agreement. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you.